Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live stream with CPAWS. Today, we are going to be talking about native trout in Alberta, why native trout matters, what kind of issues they're facing here in Alberta, and of course, what we can do to promote their recovery. I'm super excited to have three guest speakers on with us today who are all experts in the field of fish and their biology and their habitat. So I'll go ahead and bring our guests on now, and they can go ahead and introduce themselves. Hi there, how are you guys doing today?
Great, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. All right, Leslie, why don't you go ahead and start with your introductions?
Sure. So my name's Leslie Peterson. I'm the Alberta biologist at Trout Unlimited Canada. We're actually a national organization, and we have an office here in Calgary and our other offices in Guelph. And a lot of the work we do is focused on conservation, restoration, and education. And we do a lot of work on native trout all up and down the eastern slopes of Alberta, but in other parts of Canada as well.
Great, and I'm Katie Morrison. I'm the Conservation Director with CPAWS in Southern Alberta, and we do a lot of work on native trout in our chapter because we have two threatened native trout species within our region, and it overlaps a lot with the work that we do on land use planning and big picture landscape scale conservation, and so I will be bringing that perspective.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Lauren Fitch. I'm a professional biologist, and I've been working on native trout conservation and management since 1971. First of all, as a provincial fish and wildlife biologist, and then the last part of my career as a provincial riparian specialist for the stewardship initiative called Cows and Fish. I continue to write and advocate for native trout conservation. When we think about native trout and whether or not it's important to us, I think the first question is, what is a native trout? And there are 5 species of stream-dwelling native trout that came into Alberta as tourists just after the melting of continental and alpine glaciers some 12,000 years ago next Tuesday, and became residents. And so they have adapted and evolved to our watersheds. Those 5 species of stream-dwelling trout are West Slope cutthroat trout, bull trout, Athabasca rainbow, Arctic grayling, and mountain whitefish. And we have one other native trout species, generally a lake-dwelling species, lake trout. So if you're watching this and you're asking yourself, why should native trout matter to me? Well, if you're an angler, maybe it's self-evident. But if you're not an angler, consider this. Native trout, their presence, their distribution, their abundance are an indicator, they're a symbol, they're a report card for how we have treated the watersheds in which they live. And so if you consider this, whatever we do in a watershed, all of our human-based activities, grazing, logging, mining, recreation, including off-highway vehicle traffic, all of that happens in the watershed flows by or through a fish. And so if the fish are suffering, as many native trout species are, it tells us something about the state of our watersheds. The fact that we have watersheds that have native trout in them are, in my mind, the gold seal of water quality, because all of us are downstream water drinkers, and so we survive and thrive on water just as the native trout do.
They really do live in all the best places, don't they, Lauren?
Some of the most spectacular landscapes in Alberta, yes. And I'm not going to tell you where they are.
No. So one of the questions is, what is the status of native trout populations in Alberta? As Lauren indicated, it's not really great in a lot of situations. So bull trout, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and I guess federally, the Alberta populations are separated into 2 designatable units, so 2 sort of population units. And one includes the Bow Old Man red deer in North Saskatchewan, so the southern part of the province, and that one is called the Saskatchewan Nelson population. And the other is considered the Western Arctic, so that would be the watersheds to the north, the Athabasca piece. And those, so the northern populations, the Western Arctic, are considered special concern, and the southern ones in the Saskatchewan watersheds are considered threatened federally. And they were actually just listed federally under the Species at Risk Act last year. So that's bull trout. And then we've got West Slope cutthroat trout that only exist in the Bow and Old Man watersheds. And those are also listed as threatened under the Species at Risk Act. Athabasca rainbow trout, which is actually a really neat story because they're the only native rainbow trout in the province. And a lot of anglers are used to fishing for rainbow trout. You know, rainbow trout are on every continent on the planet except for Antarctica. They, you know, people are very familiar with them, but the only native population we have in Alberta is in the Athabasca watershed. And unfortunately, those are listed as endangered. So that's the, I guess, the worst situation before extinction. So pretty dire situation for those Athabasca rainbows. And Arctic grayling are also listed as special concern, and you'll find those in the northern part of the province as well.
And I'll just note, Leslie. Leslie's talking about the status, and 2 of the species, bull trout and Athabasca rainbow trout, their federal recovery plans are out right now and open for consultation. So I think Kira's going to throw those into the chat or into the comments that folks can look those up and have a say on how we best recover those species in the province and in the country.
So
yeah, just to add to that, those
comments in context. For one of the species, West Slope cutthroat trout, it means that we're down to about 5% of their native range that is still occupied with pure strain native West Slope cutthroat trout. And thinking about this, you know, I've had the opportunity to read old journals, the reports from Northwest Mounted Police posts, and also to go through the photographic archives of various museums in Alberta. And all of these tell quite an astounding story about the cornucopia of trout resources that we once had in the province up and down the eastern slopes. One photo really resonates with me. It's a photo of 3 anglers with a small child, which indicates they were probably out for one day. They're on a small stream called Trout Creek, which flows off the east side of the Porcupine Hills. Ironically, it still has West Slope cutthroat trout in it in the headwaters. But they're standing beside a pile of cutthroat trout caught in one day's angling that I've estimated to be 125 pounds of trout. That, I think, tells a story about how far we have slid in terms of native trout populations in the province.
Yeah, there's not too many trout left in Trout Creek, unfortunately, I think, Lauren.
No, and I
maybe
think
also related, there's not a lot of willows left on Willow Creek.
No. And I think it gets into, well, so where did the trout disappear to? Well, I think the simple answer is we killed them. And we may not have killed them with over-angling, but we might have done so with all of our land use activities, all of those things that have diminished the habitat to the point where it's no longer suitable for a native trout or even an introduced trout to live in. And I think it speaks to the 3 H's of issues that native trout face. One is habitat. Another one is hybridization, particularly for West Slope cutthroat trout that interact and hybridize with introduced rainbow trout populations. And the other one is harvest. Even though we may have many of these species on catch and release only, there's still a significant mortality factor, even with catch and release, that for a small population can be quite threatening.
So yeah, I see we've got a question there from Chris asking what each of our organizations, or I guess in Lauren's case, his organization affiliation and individually are doing to support native trout populations. Do you want to go first, Leslie, and then I'll chime
Sure.
back in?
Yeah, so Trout Unlimited Canada, a lot of our work is focused on the habitat piece that Lauren mentioned. So we do restoration work, and we work with a lot of different partners, whether provincial government, federal government, municipalities, other nonprofits and volunteers, and our chapters across the province. We work together to identify the priorities for restoration and work together to restore habitat where it's been degraded. One of the things we've done a few projects in the last few years is reconnections. So there's some places where fish can't access their habitat because a culvert, for example, might be blocking passage to upstream habitat. Maybe the culvert is undersized or hasn't been maintained well or installed properly, several decades ago. And we'll work with partners to replace that with something that will pass fish and allow them to access their habitat. We've done that kind of work. We do a lot of work on riparian, so that's shoreline restoration, and try and introduce native plant communities back to creeks where they've been degraded, and restore that health to the creeks so that it can make a good home for fish again. And we do some education and outreach activities as well. And that's, I guess, the primary focus of the work that we do.
Yeah, and that leads well into the work that we do, in that a lot of what Leslie is doing is sort of the on-the-ground, the riparian and in-stream habitat. And then we tend to look at things from a little bit bigger picture. So we look at a lot of what policies and practices are in place that might be damaging to trout habitat, and trying to improve those policies and practices, whether that's through working on land use plans, provincial land use plans, about what kind of activities are appropriate where, and how that might affect native trout habitat. That could be working with particular land users, whether that's forestry or industry, or recreation, to try and avoid areas of native trout habitat. And then and some of those policies and regulations that manage that as well. And then also working on education. I think not a lot of people understand the importance of native trout, and therefore can't or aren't interested in being engaged in recovery because they just don't know. And so getting folks engaged in both understanding native trout, but also what actions they can take either on the policy front or with partners like Trout Unlimited to actually help recover trout in the province.
And my organization, or at least the one I was associated with for a number of years, Cows and Fish, works in concert with organizations like Leslie's, with Trout Unlimited, with watershed councils, with watershed groups, and also with farmers and ranchers to manage that thin green line along streams better to the benefit of native trout. And personally, like Leslie, I have sat on both the bull trout and the West Slope cutthroat trout recovery teams to add my expertise and to continually prod governments to get on with the job of restoration activities. And often that requires a lot of writing of essays and articles to increase awareness about the plight of native trout and what trout mean to us, not just if you're an angler, but if you're a water drinker and a person that wants a healthy, functioning landscape in your upstream headwaters.
And I think all of that is a good point, in that recovery of native trout is not going to be one thing. It's not just going to be proper fish handling practices, and it's not just going to be restoration or changing policies. There's a lot of everything from the top level policy to regulations of how land users use the land, to individual stewardship, to restoration, to making sure that folks know how to responsibly use the landscape. So I think that a lot of people who are working in all the different areas of native trout recovery, it's going to be really important.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, we do a lot of restoration work, but ideally we wouldn't have to. So it's really important to protect those places that we have intact, good wild and stable habitat, because it is so much more costly and a lot more resources and a lot more work to fix something than it is to just prevent it from getting bad in the first place. So I think the work that CPAWS and others do is really important as well.
There's a message from Amanda. Hello, Amanda. She's asking, there's a lot of work ongoing and much more that needs to be done. How do you prioritize it because of limited resources? Well, using West Slope cutthroat trout as an example, doing the work to define genetically where those peer populations are becomes the first line of defense in keeping those populations healthy so that they can expand outwards into watershed portions that don't have those populations. But I think this is a larger issue. There's a sense that the costs of restoration for a fish species are really just about, how do we maintain angling opportunities? And economically, that is important. But I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that native trout are symbols and report cards. And if we don't take care of watersheds, if we don't put the resources into protection and also into restoration, because a lot of the sections of the streams that these fish exist in or did need extensive restoration. This is also about protecting ourselves in terms of the downstream effects of unhealthy watersheds, poor water quality, periodic flooding, for example, and also the lack of recreational opportunities that our eastern slopes give us. That is an economic driver for the province. And so part of this, I think, is understanding that prioritizing the resources to restore native trout populations isn't just about the trout themselves, it's about us.
So Megan is asking, how can we engage students in school communities? And I'll start a little bit about this, and I don't work in our CPAWS education team, but I know our CPAWS education team does a lot of work in schools and with students. And part of that is their forest program, is their wetland program, is their water programs, and all of those on some level address native trout. And some of them I know they do water quality sampling and looking at invertebrates, which are things that trout eat, and tying it all back into that, which again, we tend to then focus on what are the big picture land use issues that are contributing to declines of these areas. I know, Leslie, your TU also does some education pieces as well.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of that is really about getting kids or anybody really interested in not only the fish but the water, and understanding how things are all connected, and the role that every one of us plays. And ultimately, if you don't know about these animals and the places that they live, you won't be as interested in protecting them. So I think a big part of it is just getting those messages out there and getting people to understand and then appreciate these animals for what they are and the places that they live.
Cows and Fish has a unique game for kids based on a game show format called Cows, Fish, Cattle, Dogs, and Kids. And having participated in this, it's a wild ride.
Did you learn a lot about fish?
Dice, have to answer questions to successfully move their cattle dogs and herds of cattle through a riparian environment. And in so doing, it creates the sort of understanding about what are the parts of the environment that trout need, and how can we better manage those parts for their benefit and us.
It's a great game.
And I think even just getting kids outside, getting kids out into the places where trout live, even if they're not seeing the trout, even if they're not interacting with the water, but having those conversations about these places that I think particularly water. It's hard for us to think about what happens underwater because we don't live underwater. But yeah, having those conversations, even taking kids fishing to have interaction with with the animals and see that what lives under there and what they need to continue to live in the water.
I think
Snorkel
that's a
and
great
mask is
point, Katie, is that we don't live in the water. It's a foreign environment to us. And so, we can become all dewy-eyed about a fawn or a wolf or a grizzly bear, but it's hard to hug a slimy fish. And yet,
I'll just say.
Yeah, and yet they're as intriguing in their life cycle requirements as all these other ones. And so, one of the things that we probably need to promote more in Alberta, not just with angling, but fish watching, getting people to peer into the water and start to appreciate the life that, really is a mystery to us.
Yeah, a snorkel and mask is a really great tool for getting some insight into that amazing underwater world. Even if it's just along a lake margin, you'll see lots of really cool minnow species doing their thing, and you might see some, you never know what you're going to see until you put your head underwater. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. I think part of that would be to get people to appreciate a fellow life traveler in a medium that we don't understand, that has gone through a tremendous amount of evolution and adaptation for our watersheds. And if you think about it, native trout, they've rolled the storms, they've rolled the floods, they've rolled the droughts, fires, landslides, ice jams, winters, predators into their DNA. And that's allowed them to survive in a really turbulent, rigorous environment. All of our east slope streams are like cement mixers when you think about what fish have to live through. But what we've done is we've added complexity and more uncertainty in terms of beyond the range of natural variation that those trout have evolved with. And that's why they're disappearing from our landscape. And if they are an indicator of a change in the landscape, it should tell us something about the world that we live in.
Yeah, that's a good point, Lauren. Like you said, they've been here for 10 to 12,000 years doing, pretty good without us.
Yep.
And it's really only in the last number of decades that numbers have really declined. And I think, it's some of the activities on the landscape that have prevented them, their resiliency to withstand the natural range of variation and, rain and storms and melt and flood and all of those things.
Yeah. Samuel has asked an interesting question. How have the recent suspensions of environmental regulations affected watersheds and trout populations? And there's a number of ways of answering this, and I'll get Katie and Leslie to weigh in as well. But I think that if we don't inventory, if we don't monitor on a regular basis, we miss the opportunity to see those subtle shifts and changes that happen in water quality, which is a driver of trout populations, and we may miss a significant factor in their disappearance. And I think it's not just the suspension of environmental regulations that should be of a concern to us. It's the proposal to increase the annual allowable cut of timber harvest. It's the suspension of the coal policy, which opens up many areas to potential coal mining. And it's also about the potential to end some of the jobs for civil servants that are the people that inventory, that monitor, that create the oversight and provide the enforcement for maintaining trout populations. So all of this is and should be a concern to us Albertans who should appreciate our fellow travelers, the native trout.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add to that, Lauren. I think, just as Lauren said, the monitoring is so important, and we often don't even, the government folks don't have enough capacity to be doing that monitoring under regular time. So further restricting that capacity and putting something like that, the environmental monitoring on hold can only be a risk to the trout. And as Lauren keeps talking about, our water quality, trout are important, but so is the drinking water that I drink, and those two are so clearly connected. And then there's a question from Tanis on a similar question on parks optimization and how that might, thanks for the brackets, parks optimization, and how that might affect native trout populations. And if you guys are okay, I'll launch right into this one and you can jump in. I think that's, it's a really good question and something that I am really concerned about. A lot of the protected areas or parks that are slated for being delisted are in trout habitat. They're not necessarily protecting critical habitat as it stands now, but what I see the real risk is if we remove all those places that are set up for people to camp safely and responsibly. They have hardened surfaces where people can camp and park their trucks or cars, which stops sediment from going into streams. That happens when people are just random camping. Without some of the recreation regulations, there could be an increase of people crossing streams or rivers that contain native trout, or using motorized vehicles through them. And so I think what it could really do is put additional pressure on our public lands that are already under a lot of pressure from recreation, unmanaged recreation, and some just blatantly irresponsible recreation and practices. And that could really affect native trout. I'm actually quite worried about that. Lauren or Leslie, anything to add on that?
No, I think you got that, hit the nail on the head there, Katie, and that we've there's already a lot of pressure out there on the landscape, and a number of those sites are, they're set up for camping with the facilities and the parking and roadways and things like that. And I don't know what's going to happen, if it will mean more random camping without those kind of protections, and just add more pressure to other areas.
David has asked a question: how do we approach motorized users to join this conversation? It's a complex answer, but I think first of all of us have to appreciate that, as Katie pointed out, the eastern slopes where trout live is a busy landscape now. In fact, it's a pressure cooker of land uses. And the cumulative effect of those land uses has meant that trout populations have declined significantly, to the point that they are either threatened or in some cases endangered. And so one of the things to recognize is that there are ecological thresholds that once they're exceeded, it's very difficult for many of our wild species, including native trout, to survive. And so one of the things that we have to be appreciative of is the sheer linear development, the amount of kilometers of roads and trails that are present on a watershed basis, what the proportion is within the watershed, how many times those roads and trails cross drainages and streams. And if we've exceeded those ecological thresholds, we have to draw back. And in fact, virtually all of the work that's been done on the eastern slopes to assess what the linear density is has shown that we are often orders of magnitude higher than what the ecological threshold is. And so this cries out for restoration activities. It cries out for an opportunity to slow down some of the development, and as well, I think, an acceptance on the part of all of us, including motorized users, that we can't use the landscape at the same frequency and intensity that we have been using it at.
Yeah, I think all of what Lauren says makes so much sense, and I think it is a really tough conversation to have, and a lot of people have been figuring out how best to have it, because no one likes to be told that their activity is having an impact sometimes on things that they also care about. And I think some of those is looking at that high-level policy and regulations that allows people to act responsibly on the landscape, so they don't have to make individual choices. And then another thing that we're doing, and Leslie and I are part of a native trout collaborative team with with Cows and Fish, with Alberta Conservation Association, Alberta government, some other folks, really looking at how do we elevate the role or the importance of native trout across Alberta with all Albertans, but also looking at various groups. What types of messages can we use that will best resonate with the people out there using the landscape? And so that we're still in sort of early stages, but we've had some. We had a survey out a few weeks ago to collect information from folks about what's resonating with them. How do we best communicate to motorized users, but also anglers, to ranchers and farmers downstream, the importance of native trout.
Yeah,
Katie,
and just to add to that.
Sorry, go ahead, Leslie.
I was just going to say. Go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in, kind of talking about taking action. A lot of people are concerned about the issues that our native trout are facing, but are feeling at a bit of a loss on what they can do and how they can proceed to help protect native trout populations. Do you guys have any recommendations on how people can urge government to take more action?
Well, I think the first step is there are lots of organizations, and 2 of them are represented on this call, that if you get in contact with them, they can provide an awful lot of the insight into the issues and also some of the necessary networking and contacts that one can make as an individual citizen of Alberta to make your voice heard in terms of your sense of what needs to be done to protect and conserve native trout.
Yeah, I think, governments don't take action on things that people don't care about. And so I think letting your elected representatives know, whether that is the Minister of Environment, but also your MLA, that you want to see more actions towards native trout recovery. It's about keeping tabs on organizations like ours, about what's going on, what are the opportunities to be involved in consultation on various land use plans or protection plans. And then also educating yourselves around responsible land use and how you as a person out on the land can have the least impact possible.
Remember that governments react to 2 things, heat and pressure. Apply both.
And talk to people about it too. Raise awareness among your own community and your own friend group or colleagues about why it's important to you, and help try and get that message across to others.
Elliot has asked a good question. What mechanisms are in place to ensure recovery goals are being achieved? And so in other words, what monitoring is being done? And I think there's a variety of things out there being done by not only the Alberta government through the fisheries branch people, but also the Alberta Conservation Association, as well as Trout Unlimited. But I think Elliot's question is good. How will we know we've achieved our goal? Especially if we don't have a good benchmark to start with to understand where we started with recovery. And oftentimes this is a critical piece that's missing. And so this becomes one of the fundamental questions that needs to be asked of government is, are you doing the necessary inventories to understand where we're at now? And when will we know that the goal has been achieved?
Yeah, and I think we all have to remember that it could take years to really see an impact from really intensive efforts. Like if you consider the life cycle of bull trout, for example, it could be 5 to 10 years before you see signals of recovery in some cases for doing a major habitat restoration or changing fishing regulation or that kind of thing. Just because of their life cycle, we're not going to see that instantaneously.
I think another piece of this, again, because I sort of work on the policy side a lot, is I always say that native fish in Alberta kind of fall in this little bit of a hole in that the threatened species are listed by the Species at Risk Act under Environment Canada, but they're really given to DFO, who manage the waterways, and then all the on-land impacts for native fish are the responsibility of the provincial government. So there's sort of jurisdictional issues on who is responsible for what and how all of those are going to work together. And sometimes they don't, which I think is sort of part of the issue we've been having on really getting recovery and strong measures in place, because it's really complex both jurisdictionally and on the land and water.
And of course, the province of Alberta has such a sterling record of getting on with the federal government.
I see there's another question from Samuel. Did we already talk about this one? Why native trout specifically are so important? No doubt our water has a tremendous diversity of life and ecology, but our trout especially at risk. Yeah, I think the water is important, and as Lauren kind of mentioned at the beginning, they're kind of an indicator of an overall system health. It's sort of the report card. If you have a healthy native trout population, chances are things are going to be okay for the other species that are living out there, whether in water or using the riparian area or the watershed as a whole. So they're that indicator, and that's one reason that they're important. Another is the Alberta heritage kind of part of it is sort of an intrinsic value for many of us, many Albertans and Canadians, that this is like the last of the best places that some of these animals still live. Their habitat has shrunk, or their range has constricted, and this is the last best of the places that they are. And so I think it's worth protecting that way, because we're running out of time. So there's a little bit of urgency, I guess, to the case. And yeah, I mean, I guess we also have a legal obligation to protect these animals. They're listed federally and provincially. And so there's a legal, moral obligation. I think there's a case to be made for the economics of it as well. It's there's a lot of places in the United States where it's a really exceptional opportunity to fish for native trout in their native range. And it's if we lose it, we don't get it back. So we want to protect that and keep those opportunities for both recreation, but also just to know that they exist and to know that we've done okay on managing the landscape so that it can still support those species.
And I think as well, Leslie talked about the ethical or the moral part of it. If a watershed has its native trout population disappear in one human generation, it doesn't speak well about us.
Thank you, guys. So we had one more question from Lisa, who is wondering if it would be worth it to create a diplomatic team to go out and engage the public land use zone users on the land. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that in looking through how people respond to messages and become engaged in issues is sort of the peer-to-peer model, right? So folks trust and believe and are more likely to take action from when they're hearing messages from people that they relate to. So whether that's someone that you know, but also someone, say, in your recreation group. So I think the idea of having recreation clubs and groups, real champions of native fish, and out there both in their meetings and club meetings, but also as they're out recreating, talking to their peers about a native trout and why you should or shouldn't be doing certain things on the landscape, or how certain land use activities are affecting trout to get people more engaged, is a really effective model. I don't know that we have that right now, but for sure it's something that I think would be valuable.
For sure.
So I see another question about what regulatory changes, this is from Jonathan, what regulatory changes do we need to advocate for to streamline the process for restoration work? It's a good question. There's a regulatory system in place to protect habitat. So if I wanted to build something, like a shopping mall next to native trout habitat, I'm going to need a lot of permits and approvals to do that. If I want to build something to restore trout habitat, I have to go through basically the same approval process. It's just not really set up or designed for restoration work. And it's one of the, obstacles that we sometimes encounter is it can be difficult for some groups to navigate that process. And don't get me wrong, that process is in place for a very good reason to protect those places. But I think there's probably some opportunities to have a different regulatory framework for low risk restoration activities, that the sole purpose of it is to restore habitat. It's not like a money making venture or something like that. One thing you could do actually is the provincial government has a red tape reduction initiative. You could submit that as an idea on the Cut Red Tape website as an opportunity to streamline that regulatory process for restoration work.
Jonathan's question is a good one, and I know it's been part of many of the organizations represented here and others that have made submissions to the federal government and to provincial agencies about how to separate doing restoration work from building a pipeline crossing, as an example, or the one that Leslie used. And I don't know where we're at with that, but we need to streamline it because the organizations that are doing the restoration work don't have the resources or the time behind them to go through this very heavy regulatory set of hoops to accomplish what is really in the public interest.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much to Leslie, Katie, and Lauren for joining us today. That was a really great conversation, and it seems like there are a lot of people out there who are interested in learning more about native trout and what they can do to support their populations. Any of the resources that you guys mentioned or talked about today, we'll go ahead and post in the comments below. But thank you guys so much for joining our live stream today. If you did want to learn any more about our organizations or about the work that Leslie, Lauren, or Katie are doing, again, we'll link that information in the comments below. Thank you guys so much. Have a good one.
Thanks for having us.